Good day, everyone. We are so excited to join you for our new season of Leading Conversations. I am here with Denis Barnard, and I am Dr. RAEDENE Copeland. And we just want to lead off the year talking about issues around employee advocacy and work environments and the challenges of leading, but also how do you thrive in toxic work environments? So that's what we're here to talk about today. And I just want to say hello, Denis. How are you?
Hi, RAEDENE. How are you? Yes, I'm fine, thanks. Yes, and really looking forward to today's topic.
Exactly. So, so we're happy that you're listening today. We're starting on a little solemn note because as we prepped, for our next recording of Leading Conversations, we were thinking of talking about influential leading, right? So how do you lead with influence? However, unfortunately, we were really struck by the sad case of Dr. Candia-Bailey, who took her own life at Lincoln University due to a toxic work environment. So that really highlighted to us the importance of coming together and really having these conversations about what do we do when we find ourselves in toxic work environments. And just reading through the comments on LinkedIn, Denis, I realized that there are many people who can relate. It does not matter their background, but yet still, when we're caught in that situation, I think the overwhelm may make people not necessarily apply a strategic approach to pursuing justice for their situation. So what do you want to add from that with your background and experience?
First of all, I'd like to emphasize it is a real tragedy. And, as an HR person, I was obviously very interested to see what had happened. And looking at the evidence that is available, particularly the first thing I read about this, the thing that struck me was the letter that was written by a chief HR officer to Dr. Candia-Bailey, explaining that there had been an investigation about her allegations, that they rejected them, and actually they made assumptions about why she had complained, which were probably quite incorrect, which had no place in that letter. The other thing that struck me from an HR point of view is the fact that if Dr. Candia-Bailey had actually had a rating of 36 out of 100, one would have expected reference to or the presence of a personal improvement plan, which is what normally is put in place. If we actually go back, we'll see that Dr. Candia-Bailey had actually achieved well. So how this rating came about is not clear. There's no explanation. So, we don't have all that to hand. But I have to say that if you have an employee of the caliber of Dr. Bailey, then, and you come out with a 36 point out of 100 rating, you would expect to have a rather detailed improvement plan to say, why it's going wrong and so on. Now, the fact that there's no reference to that leads me to the inevitable conclusion that they were just going to let the thing ride. And when you start taking all this, and maybe I'm laboring the point too much, but if you take this in account of the fact that both the president and the chief HR officer must have been aware of any mental issues that Dr. Candia-Bailey had, I don't see anything in that letter that's helping whatsoever. If they knew about that background, just a blunt denial of the allegations without any further recourse, no idea of how to improve her performance, allegedly, it looks as if they were just letting it go. And if that was the case, I think there's something that they really need to be answering to. This sounds a little controversial, but the employer owes a duty of care to the employee. And then, to my mind, everything I've seen so far shows that that duty of care was not exercised. And that leads on to a much bigger problem. And that's sort of outside of the scope of our discussion, but it's certainly very heavy.
Yes, definitely. And I just, want to say condolences to her husband, her mom. I heard that she was an only child. I read that. And
Absolutely, yeah.
her family and friends. And it's everything you're saying is true. I posted about that on LinkedIn when I found the letter and I read it. And just knowing of these instances, I have posted multiple times just for the person in the back who may not have ever heard. HR is not your friend. HR is there to protect the company. Now, I do think that there are a lot of sincere people working in HR. It is a career path, so it's not really an indictment of their intentions. It is the role they play in the bigger system, right? So I think employees really do believe what is written in terms of HR is there. I can go to HR when I need support, and they can, with benefits and a lot of different things. But their
Yes.
goal is to protect the institution. So really and truly, there is, to me, no excuse for the tone of that letter. And that's the part I would hold them
It
accountable.
wasn't helpful. Definitely not helpful.
It was not. I was like, yeah, that definitely pushed that domino, because it was just like you refuse to take accountability for your poor work. And as Dr. Candia-Bailey said in her letter to the president, well, if I was operating so poorly, why was there not a duty of care? Like, why did not pull me aside and say, hey, your work is not up to standard? Why, in her words, and give her credit for that, leaving her story so we don't have to assume, is that if I were that bad, like, why did you not care for me? Why did you not, tell me you need to improve and give me an improvement plan and give me that type of support I need?
Correct.
That only after she disclosed her mental health diagnosis that they started the behavior magnified, right?
Yes.
That is when she started having issues. And I think this is a good time to talk about just the breadth of issues that employees have. Like, so many people are like, well, tell people you have a mental health diagnosis.
It's
and they
not easy.
do that, and then they're like,
yeah, they're kind of, yeah, I know. Yeah. I just want to jump in there and say, look, HR is definitely not your friend, but it's not that they're necessarily your enemy.
Right.
I think in a nutshell, HR is there to ensure the company is compliant. That's one aspect. It's there to do other things like to help enable the development of employees and so on. But as far as that aspect, HR is not an employee's advocate. That's what unions are for, and employee councils. It's there to ensure the employer is compliant as far as employment legislation goes. It might actually say we're here to make sure it's ethical, but that's a little more difficult to define. The problem for me is when employers do not treat their employers well, is the moment that HR should be standing up and saying, look, this is going against the employment legislation, it's illegal, or it's going against the spirit of the legislation. So it's not employee advocacy, it's trying to keep employers on the right track. And if, an employer said to you, we're going to do this, and you say it's illegal, then that is the moment you have to decide whether you're going to stand for your principles and the law, or whether you're going to go along and nod it through. And I think, that's the big dilemma. And HR has to show its colors. We're supposed to be, we're not the friend of the employer or the employee. We're there to try and make sure that everything runs between the guidelines. And if it doesn't, then we should actually speak up. But the problem is, so many people have got mortgages to pay and things. They go along to get along.
You know, it's so funny you say that because I was thinking, you were talking and I was thinking and processing, and I was in the process of writing this post on LinkedIn about the book, The 48 Laws of Power. And and that book is really something, right? Because you're reading these laws and you're like, wow, I saw online there are people who read this book 4 times, like they call it their Bible. And you see where, okay, you're like, okay, I can definitely see some of these things as good tips, but it's really showing you how people think and what people do to rise the ranks, right? In power, to
Oh,
rise in power,
yes.
but also
Uh,
maintain it. But going back to what you're saying, one of the laws is do not outshine the master and so forth. And I'm thinking, well, HR, they're in a position, even the chief HR officer, they're still below the president and the board. And do they
oh, yes.
really have true power? And how do they navigate? I'd love to hear from chief HR officers. You would have to be pretty savvy. I'm not saying that you cannot see that the laws are being broken, but in her case, right, what we're thinking of, this is a VP. She's a VP and she's complaining about the president.
Yeah.
And we know that in few circumstances in that hierarchy, that's the thing. The employee does not have a lot of leverage standing on his or her own to go
Yeah.
up against the president. So, which would cue me into this transition of let's talk about a situational crisis where an employee feels as if they're in a toxic situation for whatever reason they perceive. And I just want to say this, it could be for whatever reason. If you're in a toxic environment, the only thing to focus on is that you are in a toxic environment. And once you are facing that and feeling that, you have to step aside, get the emotion out, and now start into a strategic process. So let's try to outline what happens and what is the strategic process. So you're feeling you're in a toxic work environment. I will just start by saying in my post on LinkedIn, I address the fact that look in the mirror first, because I believe in accountability. Are you doing everything that you're called upon to do? No, you're not perfect. Yes, you're going to make mistakes, but are you doing everything you're called
Yeah.
upon to do? Are you getting good feedback, but the behavior, the way you're being treated is counter to what they're telling you? Because I've had a lot of peers who got good feedback verbally or got feedback, but yet still when they got their evaluations, they were really low. So they were kind of confused. There was this dissonance there and incongruence with what you're telling me. So I'm thinking I'm doing well, but then
Yeah.
how did I
Well,
get like a below average review?
well, that's a good point because, at every appraisal meeting or review of performance, notes should be taken. And notes can be taken that are then agreed by both parties. So there's obviously something happened that a rating of 36 out of 100 was given. And, Dr. Candia-Bailey was not in agreement with that. So at no point in that, there should have been a discussion. Let's talk about your performance. These are your objectives. You met these, or you didn't do this, or you did that, and so on. And our rating is X, and we believe that this explains why. Are we in agreement with this? Do you disagree? Let's talk about it. You come to a consensus. But it appears that in this case, she was given this rating without any recourse to discussion or anything like that. So obviously that part of the procedure is wrong. You can't have a one-sided assessment. You might say, I think you're worth 36. And I would then turn around and say, well, actually, looking at my objectives and what I've done, I think I'm a 62. So, okay, let's talk about these issues and come to a consensus that we agree, and how do we improve and so on. That's the civilized way of doing it. This appears to have been missing. And just one other little footnote to her case, she raised a grievance. It was allegedly investigated. We don't know how. If she didn't like what was written by the CHRO, in European and UK legislation, she would have had the right to appeal against that and would have appealed to someone above the president, which I guess would be the board of trustees. There has to be that mechanism. If the trustees turn around and say, no, sorry, it's no good, then the process is exhausted. But there should have been that right of appeal to go above the whole thing to the ultimate authority and say, look, this is my case. It's like going to the International Court of Justice. And this is my case. I don't believe I've been treated rightly. Please consider. So that was, on that specific case, that was what was wrong. But getting back to this, I got this rating. I don't think it's right. And there was no agreement. There was no conversation or discussion, no consensus between the president and Dr. Candia-Bailey. She says, I got a 36. And why did I get a 36? That's wrong. So there's no evidence of a discussion. And, the fact that there hasn't been a discussion leads me to believe, and this is purely my opinion, is that hard conversation or that difficult conversation that the president should have had didn't actually take place.
Yes, well, based on, as you know, and just for all the listeners, we do not know all the facts. I did watch Roland Martin Unfiltered and paused and read through her letter because he was just skimming through it. But I think from the letters, Dennis, they did have discussions, but she felt like she was stonewalled and maybe made a mockery of and so forth. Like she felt like she couldn't quite get answers, but we don't know the extent. We just know what it led to. I would say maybe just at this point here, just to cue leadership, and we'll get back to the strategies employees can use, is that maybe it is helpful. I know it's it feels just very anxious when they're like, hey, rate yourself before, my university do the rate yourself before you meet with your boss, so then we can see what you thought and what we thought. And I remember just feeling like, oh, that's so difficult because for myself, I feel as if I'm just critically hard on myself, right? So that's the curse of having super high standards for yourself. Sometimes you do have that balance of just being self-critical, right? So even in the book 48 Laws of Power, they're like, never taking responsibility for your mistakes, throw somebody else under the bus. Yeah, that is one of the laws. And you see people play this out. I remember when Barack Obama.
All the time.
So I was like, the book is basically telling you what people do to rise in rank and maintain their power. Like they're never wrong. And I thought about that because I'm like, dang, I'm the opposite. Every time I make an error, I'm like, that was me. Oh, I should have done that. Because to me, that is part of my growth mindset. But I realized that you're also just giving people all the information of like, oh, she's highlighting all her errors. I may not have seen it. But the point I'm getting back at is that it's really very hard. I knew this even with my students when I was a professor, that if you have them grade their own work, grade each other's work, I always told them that I have discovered that they're harder on each other than the professor would ever be. And that's just the nature. So I'm thinking maybe for leaders in this situation, just at this assessing employee evaluation is at the beginning of the role. You maybe give the employee and say, these are the criteria you would be rated on. Or as an employee, you ask for that. So you can really look at it and you can have like a vision of, okay, this is what I'm going to be rated on. It's not just when I get to the end. So you can really just grow with it, right? So I just want to close that out and say that may be a good leader strategy, but also as an employee, you need to empower yourself and say, hey,
I think it highlights the need for clear and identifiable measures and targets.
Exactly.
And because if you have those, it's no difficulty for the employee to evaluate. Now, these were my targets for the year. This is what I've done, or whatever. This is what I've done, and that should actually agree with what the interviewer is going to come and talk to you about anyway. So there shouldn't be a great disparity. And
Yeah.
that's part of leadership, is ensuring those things are clear.
Right.
And you know, just talking about the HR function itself, part of the great upheaval in HR right now is because there are no clear measures for the function that are directly attributable to HR activity. That's just me in parentheses. But yes, as far as leadership goes, you must set clear and identifiable targets. If there's no clarity in that, you've got ambiguity, and then you start with problems. You're absolutely 100% right about owning up to your own mistakes. There's nothing wrong with it. The only people who seem to have difficulty with that are people in corporations and companies. They seem to think that it's a sign of weakness to actually admit that you screwed up. Well, I find it easier to sleep at night, and I think it also tells my people and the people I deal with something about me. If I've got a responsibility, it's down to me. And if I don't carry that through, I'm happy to stick my hand up and say, I didn't do that, and I messed up, and I'm sorry, and I'll get it right, or whatever. But that's got to be a key aspect. And it's so difficult for people in corporate environments, because the basic emotion in corporate environments is fear. Fear of loss of promotion, fear of loss of face, fear of X, Y, Z. You know, that's why nobody admits to mistakes. That's why everybody shovels the responsibility onto the nearest available person, usually the HR department.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so, yeah, and because that should be part of a growth culture. And I have seen a lot of people have that in their value statements, like we believe in a growth culture, but do you really believe in a growth culture? And that would only come from when, okay, back to our context here, an employee is given feedback. Is growth only expected of the employee, or is growth expected of all leaders? And is that being modeled?
And the organization needs to mature also.
Exactly. So sometimes that's why they are toxic environments. And maybe that's the difference with organizations that have a stronger culture. So back to our thing here, because we're listing what steps an employee can take if they find themselves in a toxic work environment or under a toxic leader. Well, if you're in a toxic work environment, that means the leader is toxic and some of your peers are toxic, and no one is really addressing it, or your advocacy is falling on deaf ears. So step one would be self-accountability and really ensuring that you have all your documentations, that you have emailed for clarity, and if something happened, you have evidence of, no, like when this happened, I got this feedback, I did it, or this has been happening on this day, I emailed my superior and communicated the situation. I either got stonewalled, this was the response I received, I was promised it would be handled, whatever it is. You have to make sure that all your evidence, you have all your ducks in a row for your evidence. So that's step one. If it continues to be toxic, which a lot of people who quit, leave, find themselves in very depressed states over their work, that means, okay, now you have to move to the next level. And I would say the next stage, right, we would agree, would be to pull out your employee handbook and look at what the grievance policy is, and find a friend who knows a friend who knows an employment lawyer. So I always say you step back and say, I need some informed insights on what is the most strategical and non-emotional steps to take to cover myself in this situation, so I can have like smart advocacy. So I say you start with that employee handbook, you pull it out and you read it on your own. You may not want to go to HR as yet. You may just want to understand the policy. So when you go to HR, understanding that they would want to protect the company, because they may just be trying to hear, are you going to sue? Right? Because that's the whole thing. How bad is it? Are you going to sue? What is the nature of the situation? So before you go there, you have to understand what is legally written in their handbooks, what are the employment laws to cover you, and what is the nature of your situation. And you have to be able to articulate it maybe in 3 lines, right? I feel as if you have to also find the buzzwords that they use, the legal employment law buzzwords, so people understand what it is. But Dennis, you can
Well, yeah.
Something.
I think the one thing to say about this is don't wait too long. If you start bringing your action after 2 years of suffering a toxic environment, that's going to lessen the impact. The minute you start feeling that this is really going wrong is the moment to collect evidence, and don't wait too long to start launching your case whichever way you go. A normal grievance procedure would be, in the first instance, you raise it with your immediate superior, and a standard procedure will say that person must respond in 5 days. And if they don't respond, or the response is unsatisfactory, then you escalate it to a designated person above that manager. And so don't automatically assume that it's going to be HR. HR may be called in to investigate. So read the procedure carefully, because you have to follow their procedure. If you don't follow that procedure, it's going to weaken your case. So make sure you are complaining to the right people at the right time, because the chances are that if you've got a toxic environment, the company is going to disregard its own procedures, which will hold it below the waterline and torpedo their case altogether. So look up the procedures, don't wait too long, and follow the procedures precisely. Now, I think that if you feel, if you're in a discussion about performance and it almost turns into a disciplinary, I think any disciplinary, you should have the right to be accompanied by a colleague of your choice. So there is a witness to this. And a disciplinary meeting should be followed by comprehensive notes about what was said at that meeting. So that's the disciplinary part. But the grievance part, the same thing. I think if you're going to raise a grievance, you should ask that you could be accompanied by a colleague or an employee representative or something like that. So there is another pair of eyes and ears looking and seeing, and will agree with what was the outcome of that meeting. So absolutely, go to the rules and regulations and follow them precisely. If you feel that you're getting into a toxic situation, it's the only way you're going to go about solving this. I don't know, should I mention the under extreme circumstances?
Yeah, well, before you do that, I just want to say that the term
Sure.
I've used is you have to operate in good faith. So that's why before you escalate anything, you have to show evidence that I spoke to the person, I spoke to my manager, I did it multiple times. You have to have that documented. If you go above your manager, which of course is not going to be looked at nicely, but sometimes you're like, I'm operating in good faith. I think that is really the term you have to use. You're operating in good faith because you feel as if your advocacy is falling on deaf ears and it's really taking a toll on your emotional and mental health. So I just want to put that out there in terms of word choice and term usage. But there are extreme circumstances where now you're going to queue in, right? So you've went through the ranks and
Yeah. I mean, normally what would happen, you have a grievance taken there, it wasn't dealt with, it goes up higher, there's an investigation, the results of the investigation come back, you're not happy with that, you should have ultimate right of appeal to another designated person way up in the food chain, where that ultimate decision will be made. And if it still doesn't work out, then you either continue in this or you decide not. Now, if your situation is very extreme, I know for instance, the United States, you have rather less protection than you do in UK and Europe. But there is a legislation which says that employers have a duty of care to prevent toxic or hostile workplaces. So if you feel that your situation is toxic, is injurious to your mental or physical health, you could be being bullied or harassed even, and you've exhausted all those things, I suspect that your best recourse for your own well-being is to quit and give your reasons for quitting, and then go see an employment lawyer and say, look, if I stay, I went through the whole process, they didn't listen to me, they didn't agree with me, I feel that I'm right, and I'm resigning for my own well-being, and I feel that they are acting, they are not providing me with a safe workplace, which is what every employer should be doing. So there is that avenue. There's not a mass of legislation helping the worker, particularly in Europe and UK. We can claim I quit. It was what we would call constructive dismissal, because effectively the employer did nothing to stop the problem. So it's constructive dismissal, and that is a big one in the UK and Europe. But we don't have that, or you don't have that in the States. So you've got to look at that provision of a safe workplace. It's a duty of care as the employer. So there is that recourse as well. It's very extreme. But if you feel for your own wellness, your own peace of mind, or whatever, then that's the way you should go.
Yes, and document it, like
document all the way along. Absolutely.
Communicate via email that you are leaving because you tried in good faith to have your issues addressed. You took these steps. If you can write a nice one-page letter, that's fine, and you have all your supplemental information that you can document. But just say, hey, I operated in good faith. I did this. I followed the handbook. You cite the parts of the handbook, the laws in the handbook or the protocols, and you still did not get the support you needed. And you said,
exactly right.
And that's all I'm saying. It's that regardless of what, even if it goes to court, the onus is still on you to prove without a reasonable doubt what position you're taking, right?
Yeah.
So that is why it's so critically important. And I can talk to my Black peers or minority peers, is that if you're going to argue that is due to race, right, that is one of the hardest things to prove in court. It may definitely be about race, but you just have to make sure that you have that evidence. And when that person says something, you have to have a smoking gun. So if that person says something racist, you have to document it and send an email. You have to have these things recorded. Definitely. Because it's not about, that's the thing about life, Dennis. That's the one thing I learned about life. It has nothing to do with what is actually true, right? Because people will say true is about perception and whatever, and you can't really dig into someone's intention. And a toxic leader is a toxic leader, just in different variations to different people. But what we do know is true is in a court of law, the onus of evidence is on you and your lawyer. So whatever you choose to stand by, whatever claim you're making, just make sure that you have the evidence to back
100%.
it. And I think that is the mature, grown-up, just flat out state of things.
No. I think in this particular awful, terrible case, the fact the president is white, the fact that Dr. Candia-Bailey is Black, perhaps there is an element of race in this. One cannot discount it. But I think that we both are of a mind that this looks overwhelmingly like a case of, the negligence or whatever, a failure of the system to actually manage this situation correctly. So, it has many aspects. But I think the thing that highlighted to the things I've seen shows that institutionally the procedures were not there, and they weren't applied in a humane way either, even when they came to those conclusions, rightly or wrongly, we don't know. But there are ways of dealing with things, and that was not the way. So I just hope that, anybody who's listening to this in that situation will now start to put their plan together of how they're going to deal with it.
Yes, because we are aware that, even on my post, the woman said she is, she had to quit because she was in that situation. And to your point, that's the thing. Toxic environments are toxic for a lot of people, you just have a unique case based on your personality to everything about your background in interacting with that toxic leader. So you just have to document and know what you know, but just understand that your intuition, and if they never say anything prejudice, and I'm not talking about it, it could be about anything. It could be about your personality, your voice. If they never say anything, then you really have to document stuff and have a strong case. Now, there's no shame in just walking away. There are like over 5,000. I mean, there are a lot of companies wherever you are. It's not easy to job search. It's actually one of the most
well, there are always more jobs, but we only get one life. And I think, if something that has shown up in here, our work is not our life.
Exactly.
Our work is just a part of our life.
Exactly.
And that is part of the real tragedy of this situation.
Yeah.
And all we can hope is that we can actually, something good comes out of this for other people who are suffering.
Yes, and I think the main thing too, in tragedies as such, and I think Dr. Candia-Bailey was brave in terms of leaving, as I said, leaving her letter and saying, this is what happened, this is what I'm doing, is that it's been a long conversation. And the whole point of us doing these things is not because we think we're above board, it has nothing to do with that. It's just you want to be part of the discussion. You desire things to be better, and you yourself have a growth mindset. So in even exploring, okay, does HR just have a bad rap? Is HR the culprit? Are they to blame? Are too many things put on their table? What really are the expectations of employees for HR? So we really wanted to discuss that whole intersection of leading and HR support and how it triangulates to support the culture of the organization. But at the end of the day, Dennis, it's simply, people just have to realize and just maybe always be looking. Let's just say that as we close out. A company, you may meet phenomenal people at your job. You may end up at a great company, right? But regardless of what, your responsibility is for you. Always be looking, because you never know when that one leader you love changes to another manager or director and you are stuck. Always be looking. Don't get comfortable. And
never get comfortable.
Never get comfortable.
That's one lesson. After the first time I was made redundant in a job after a number of years, I decided I would never become comfortable again.
Never get comfortable.
And I'll tell you a little story just to wrap up, is that I then worked on a number of contracts. I worked on one contract where I could have had a company car. And actually, I decided to take the money. And one of the directors said to me, my God, why are you driving that old car of yours? You should take a company car. And I said, the answer is quite simple, Paul. I said, the day I'm canned, I drive home in my car. The day they fire you, Paul, you're on the bus. And I'll tell you something, he took that to heart, because shortly after he gave up his company car, took the money and bought himself a second-hand Porsche. So never get comfortable. I think
never get comfortable.
Never.
I think in your story, another tidbit to close out with is sage advice is sage advice. And I don't care who it comes from. Never downplay the voice of people. People have different experiences. They have different insights. Some people are just born with interesting perspectives about the world. But listen, your best, I guess, tool, your best tool can be active listening and reading. And when you hear good advice, take it. So that was good advice. If you're flying high now, you're soaring, you have the company car, you feel special, but that is their stuff. It's not your stuff. Take the money, let it sit in the bank and gain interest. So, okay, so.
Okay.
Okay, well, we are going to close out. That is it for our episode 1 of Leading Conversations for 2024. We look forward to chatting with you in our next episode. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Bye.